Hello, good day. In this tutorial, we are going to walk through the steps in carrying out a test-driven development of a RESTful JSON API with Rails. So I have a whole article written down for this tutorial, but I'm just going to help you see the live preview, how we are going to move back and forth, writing a test, then the test failing, then we write our model and controller code so that the test can pass. Okay, we are going to set up our Rails. So Rails, new book store. I'm going to call it bookstore API. So first, we are going to make it an API only application by using that flag. And we are going to skip the mini tests provided by Rails by default. We're going to use a Postgres database. Okay, new. So let's wait for the installation to finish. So this is what we are going to build in this tutorial. We are going to build this endpoint. We're going to have register, login, books, to add a book, to get all books, to get a particular book, to update a book, to delete a book, to add category, and get category from our books API. So our database will look like this, looking at this entity relationship diagram. So our books would have user, username, and password, a simple books, user ID, title, author, category ID, then the category name. So for the first part of this tutorial, we're just going to work on creating the books API only. Okay, let's navigate bookstore API. So the first thing we are going to do is setting up our gem. We would have some gem that are going to be really useful for us, like the RSpec Rails, the factory bot, Shoulda-Matchers for testing and database cleaner, and we're going to use Faker to generate random input data for our database. So let's look at, let's include them in the gem file. So gem. So I'm going to put them under tests. So first I'm going to start with gem, RSpec, Rails. Okay, I can use this. That should be okay. Save that. Bundle. Okay, before I generate that, let me just quickly add the rest of the gems. Under tests, oh, there is no test, so we could include that. Group test do, and so I don't forget. So I have a couple of them, so I will just copy and paste to save time. Okay, we have the database cleaner, we have the factory bot, we have the Shoulda-Matchers, and that should be all. So bundle. Okay, everything running. So the next step is to install our RSpec Rails, generate. G is enough. RSpec install. This will generate a couple of files, the .rspec, spec helper file, and Rails helper file. Okay, now that is done, let's add some configuration so we would be good to go. So first, I would have a directory for support for our factories where we would have our factory bot reside under the spec folder. So make directory spec factories. Since we are going to use the factory default directory, so configuration for data, let me quickly open Visual Studio for easy. Okay, here we are. I need to make this bigger. Okay, that is good. So we're going to add configuration for our database cleaner, factory bot, and Shoulda-Matchers. So we would have under our spec, we would have the Rails helper. So we would have to require the database cleaner on top, just below here. I can take away this comment. So our Shoulda-Matchers, we would have to add the config. Note the instruction for some of this configuration, you can find them on the documentation page. Then we would have for factory bot inside our config, where you have our spec config, so we could put it any of this place here. Okay, then for database cleaner, okay, database cleaner again for the examples. Okay, that should be it. So you have for our factory bot, first we require the database cleaner. Then what else did we do? We include the factory bot syntax. Then we add the config for database cleaner. And then we add the Shoulda-Matchers. So with this, we should be good to go. So the next thing we are going to do is we're going to generate model for our category. Let's start there. Rails, generate model, category. We only need one thing, just name is enough. By default, it gives it a string. So, and we would also, you notice it also generates the spec file for the models as well. So let's generate the book for the book at once. So G, Rails, generate model, book. We need a title, we need an author, and we need to reference a category for the category references. All right. Now that we are done, remember we are doing a test-driven development. What does that tell you? We write our spec file first, then expect it to fail, then write the corresponding code to fix it. So we have our spec. So let's start with the category. Before I proceed, let's quickly create our database and migrate for the pending migrations that we have. So I will have Rails DB create. Oh, bookstore API already exists. Okay, I think I have something like that in my database. I'm just going to modify the name. So API, this is for test. I'm going to do this too for test. Okay, development. Okay, this has test already. We can add a double test. All right, let's see what we have. Okay, database created, Rails DB migrate. All right, we are good to go. So let's write some specs. So in our category, we will have first, let's look at the association test. Association. uh, for association tests. So we say it should have many books, right? Every category should have many books. In other words, books, there are so many books that can belong to a particular category. So validation test, it's easy. Validation test. So what should we have? It should validate presence of name, which is like the category name. So I'm going to test the length too, so that we have a minimum length of 3. So it should validate length of name. We can say, break this down, dot is at least 3. Okay. So I hope this makes sense. We can put it here, it's not that long. So it should validate length of name is at least 3. So a minimum of 3 is what we expect it to have. So let's look at the book and write the unit test for the book as well. So I'm too lazy to type. So let's write association test as well. It should belong to a certain category. So validation test, it should validate presence of title of a book. Copy and paste the author of a book. What else? Okay, copy paste. It should validate the length. We want to validate the length of the title. Okay, the same thing we did for category, at least 3. All right, that is it, as simple as that. So the expressive domain specific language of RSpec and Shoulda-Matchers makes it possible to read it as if it were a paragraph. So it makes the whole reading very easy. So let's run our test. Our spec, as expected, we are going to have failed test. All right, we have 7 failures already. Okay, that is expected. Is there anyone that passed? I'm saying 7 examples, 6 failures. 4C. Which is the first test? Oh my god. Do we have anyone? Oh, that's true. If you check the model, this is the only test that passed. It belongs. Okay, now let's go ahead and fix some of this. So the category, for the category, you should you have as many books. Then we are going to validate the name as well. Validate the name to be presence true, and as well as the length too, to have a minimum of 3. Okay, let's do the same thing for the book. So the book already have the association written down. So we next thing we just need to validate the other field. Validate title. We have author, and we have presence to be true, and we have to set a length for both of them. To be a minimum of three. Okay, good. So now that we are done writing the validation and the rest, let's run our test again and see. Oh, great. Now we are good. So all our tests are passing. We are good to move on. Okay, our models are ready for this part. So let's go ahead and generate the controllers. So I will start with Rails G controller categories. All right, so the next one is Rails G controller books. Remember, your controller has to be plural. So now that we are done, your thoughts are right. So first we'll have to write a test before actually writing the controller code. So just like the title is, test-driven development. So if you notice, it generated our request spec for us. So we would go ahead and do the needful. So I'm going to go to spec files, request, so you have the books and the category specs here. So the request spec, if you notice, is not using controller, it's using request. The request specs are designed to drive behavior through the full stack, which would include routing, means it can hit the application, being able to test our HTTP endpoint mostly. So, but before we proceed, I would love us to create the factory files for our controller. So I'm going to create touch spec factories. So let's create for category and book, category.rb, book.rb. So we are going to create these two files, then define our category in there. So in category, we need to have factory dot define do. Okay. Did I define a faker? Okay, name. We're going to have a faker book. The faker gen, I got it from the how to know which one to use from the GitHub page. You will get a lot of ideas to use. Here, this one is book. I think it's double colon here. Okay. No, before that, 1 minute. We should have a factory category. Give it a name. Do. Then this. All right. Do for books. I'm just going to copy that and paste. So I'll change this to book. So here we have title, we have author. So title. So we're going to have a book title, you guess right. And the next one is going to be author. So faker, book author. Okay. Then the next one, we are going to have a category. So I will just call it create category here. Okay. All right. So now we'll create that. So let's look at our spec, but first I want us to create a custom helper method JSON to help us pass our JSON response to the Ruby hash. So under support, I'm going to create a support folder inside our spec file. Can just let's make directory. Let me clear this. So I'm going to make directory inside our spec and call it support. Okay, so we're going to create the file inside our spec support requests underscore spec underscore helper.rb. All right, so we have support requests underscore spec underscore rb here. So I'm going to make it a module requests spec helper and it. So I'm going to define JSON here, JSON.parse response.body. Okay, so this is going to help us pass our JSON while we are trying to run the test. So, but inside here, we need to enable spec folder to read file inside the support directory. So I'm going to go back to the Rails helper, and we should have where to enable it. It's always there. Okay, there is it. This is it. So it will enable the support file. So I'm just going to uncomment that out, and also inside our config file we are going to include I'm just going to add it here, config.include our request spec helper that we just created. Type is a request type. All right, so now we are done with those. Let's go ahead and write the spec request. We start with category as usual. So first I am going to clear this off. I don't need this right now. So I am just going to initialize the data for test data. So the bang symbol allows you to create it almost immediately. So I'm going to have categories. So let's create some category lists. Those are the factory bot method. So I'm going to create just 5 categories. Then let category ID to be the first ID. So categories dot first dot ID. All right. So let's test for get category. We are going to test for category endpoint. So describe get categories. All right, that will be our endpoint. So we are going to make HTTP request before each example, so we don't need to repeat it all over. So I'm going to use API versioning in this example. Version 1 categories. All right, so if we go to this endpoint, what we expect to have, it should return categories. It should return all the categories, right? Meaning we expect, remember our JSON method. So we expect JSON not to be empty at all. At least we created our files. So The next example is we also expect JSON.size to equal 5 because we created 5 examples. Don't forget, the JSON is coming from this spec helper file, so we are doing JSON.parse to get the response of our body. All right. So that's the first example. The second example, it returns status code 200 do. So we expect our response to have HTTP status of 200. So that means everything was successful and we expect it to have that response. That is forget. So let's look at post example. Post category. We have describe posts categories. All right. Do. So the first thing we want to check is let's give it a valid payload. So let's give it a valid name first, a valid name. Name horror. All right. So that's a category name. So context. Let's check each context. Context when a valid request is given. When the request is valid. So before we want to post API version 1 categories and params valid name. Okay, let me push this up here. So we are posting this on this API. So now the example, it creates a category, right? Yeah, it should create a category. Do. Now we expect JSON, the name we find inside there, to be exactly what we have, because what we are going to return back. All right, finally, it returns status code 201 created. So we expect response to have HTTP status 201. Okay, guys. So now let's look at another context when the request is invalid, right? Context when the request is invalid. Do. I'm just going to carry this. I think I'm tired of typing. So we are just going to provide, let me just provide the name right here. Name, I'm going to give an empty field. All right. So it returns a validation failure message. do. So we expect our response, the body of our response, to include something like is 2 shorts, minimum is 3 characters. Okay, that's fair enough. All right, so we should be done with that describe for this. So let's look at another scenario, another endpoint for delete. So category, stay with me now, ID, deletes, sorry. So here the same thing is going to happen. We are describing the delete categories, ID, do. So before delete, I'm going to, before delete API version 1 categories, and we are going to call our category ID, remember? All right. So it returns status code 204, meaning successfully delete. So expect response to have HTTP status code of 204. No head. It's quite long. Okay, I think we have covered most of the endpoint for category that we need. We have the get, we have the posts, and we have the delete. We're not going to add any update method here. So let's just test here before we work on the book test. So let's fix that of category because this is already too long. So let's try our spec. As usual, we have 6 failures, 1 pending. Okay, I'm just going to run the spec for the category alone. So our spec requests category so that we show what we have. So we have 6 examples and 6 failure. So what is the problem? Routing error, as usual. So we have a routing error, no route match. So that is what we're going to look at next. We're going to define our route. So let's go to config routes. Remember we did versioning, so we are going to look at that as well while we are doing that. So namespace, I'm going to do namespace, API, we're going to have namespace for version, v1, before we have our category. So resources, categories, we're going to only look at only the index, the create, and the destroy. That's our target. So let's run the spec again and see what we have. Okay, the story has changed on initialize constant API. So all of them are having the same uninitialized constant API. So let's handle that. So we are going to have make directory. I'm going to quickly make directory inside our controller. So I'm going to make directory inside our app controllers API. So the next one I'm going to make v1. Okay. So now that is done, I'm just going to, so we have app API and version 1. I'm going to move the books and categories inside it. Okay, so we have that. So, but I'm going to wrap this around the API so that we have that constant. So module API, and we have another one, module, come on, module version 1. I start this with a capital letter. So this would be inside here. And 1, 2. So this is it. We're going to do the same thing for this one and 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3. Okay. All right, that looks good. So let me see this again. Oh, now API constant is out of the way. So could not find API v1 categories controller. The action destroy could not be found. The action create could not be found. The action create could not be found. Okay, now let's write our actions. It's making sense now. So we have a controller here. So first I'm going to write a private method to handle our params private. So def category params, and so I'm just simple params.permit. We have name, just name, that's the only thing we have. So I can include another one to set the category. It's not necessary, but can come in handy. So we have at category equals to category dot find params id, and okay, now we have our private method. So I'm going to use each of the private methods. So before action, I'm going to set category only for the destroy method. That's the only thing we're using it, and we should just use it there. So the index is going to be for the get category method, of course. So at categories equals to category.all. So I'm going to render. Here, I'm not going to use a serializer. I'll just create a simple class that will handle this for me. We'll do the same thing together. So for now, let it just be the categories representer, where it takes in the categories and render them as JSON. All right. So let's write for our post, which would definitely be the create method. So the create method we would have at category equals to category dot create, and we take in category params. So we say if at category is safe, then we want to render the JSON. So I'm going to use the category representer here again, this time singular. We'll put in the category. Category, all right. Render it as JSON and add the status. Don't forget that created. Else, we are going to render JSON at categories dot errors and status unprocessable entity. It has to be a symbol. Okay, and all right, that looks like all for the, okay, just one left, the delete. So def destroy method, and so we had already put a set method, so we just call the category dot destroy, and head no content. Okay, simple. We remember we had already set this, else we would just have this inside here, then take this out. But that's okay. So now let's just go ahead and write class for this so we can go ahead and test it. So I'm going to create inside our app folder. I'm going to create clear. So I'm going to make a directory inside our app folder called representers. Then I'm going to create the two file app representers. I'm going to create category underscore representer.rb and categories underscore representer.rb. All right. So we have our representer and representers. So our first, I'm going to make it a class, category representer. So our class will initialize our first constructor, initialize with a category, and at category is equals to category. All right, and so our class method def as JSON, remember, we would return the ID to the ID of the category .id, and we would also return the name category.name. So as JSON, we return this. So private, call this private method, and also have our attribute reader category. We can put it on top, doesn't matter. Okay, we'll have almost the same thing for the representers, the plural form, which has to do with a lot of them, categories representer. So the same, but this would take categories, right? And these categories, and these categories as well. So, but the only difference is here we would do categories that map to category. And so we will map through this item. I think that's basically the difference. Oh, okay. I hope there is no error. If we have error, we'll definitely come out together. So let's add a few helper handlers for our error handlers. So the first one I'm going to do is under concerns. I'm going to add a response. Please, for more explanation, take a look at the article. I am just walking you through the steps in creating some of these things. It's basically to understand, so that if you have issues while implementing it, you can go through the video and see how I did it. But for the main explanation is in the article, so that's why I'm running through the code. I don't have time to explain everything because it's quite a long one. So you have module. I'm going to do module response. So what are we going to have? We'll have def JSON. I'm going to use this for error response. Object status equals to OK. Render JSON object and status. Okay, this is basically an helper method. The next one is I'm going to add an exception handler. Exception underscore handler.rb. So I'm going to copy and paste. I have the code written. For the sake of time, I will explain. So you have our exception handler, which extend active support concern. So we include the rescue from active record not found. So we'll have our JSON response that we just created here to respond the error with the status not found, error with the status unprocessed entity. So this is it. So we'll go ahead under our application controller to include them. So we want to include response, and we want to include so that it becomes available for all of our controller. So now let's try and run the test again. Our spec. So what is our failure now? Okay, I have a syntax error on line 17 of my exception handler. What could that unexpected end? Okay, I think there should be one more end, right? All right, this for this, this for this. Okay. Oh, nice, nice. So all our tests are running very well now. That is so good. That is so good. So all our tests are passing, and we are good to proceed. All right. So Okay, great. We are ready to move forward to our books API. So as usual, we are going to write tests first before writing the actual code. So let's navigate to our specs for books. Where are you? I'm going to quickly delete this off. So the first thing we're going to do, as usual, we're going to initialize the data thanks to FactoryBot books. So I'm going to create a list of books. Create list, book, 10 of them. The next one is let book ID. I'm just going to pick one book ID, the first one, books.first.id. All right, so we have described the first item, our get books API. So before that, before each example, we are going to get API v1 books. So the first thing is it returns books. So it returns list of books. Return, you can say list of books or array of books. So we expect JSON not to be empty, just the same way we had in the previous one. Expect, I feel like copying and pasting here. JSON.size to equal 10. So we're generating 10 books. So the size it returns should be exactly 10, right? So the next one, it returns a status code of this. I'm going to copy some of these things and paste because it's exactly the same. So it returns a status code of 200, expect the response to have that HTTP status. So now we are good to go with that. So let's get only one book. So describe gets, we are going to get one book. ID do. So before API v1 books. Remember our books underscore ID. Was it books on? Oh, book underscore ID. Okay. All right. So before anything, before each of the example, we want to be able to retrieve that particular book. So context when the book exists. That is context when that ID exists. When book exists. Do. So it returns. I'm just going to move this. I think it's literally the same thing. So it returns a status code of this 200, expect this. Fine, that's it, exactly the same thing. So it returns the book item. Do expect the JSON ID that we are going to retrieve to equal book underscore ID. So we should have exactly that if everything works fine. So the next context we're going to look at is when that book or when the ID provided or the book doesn't exist in our database. So we want to say let book ID. Of course, we want to have a book ID with 0, right? 0. So it's supposed to return, it returns status code 404 not found. Do. So same thing like this, only that we need to have 404. All right. So we should have a not found message in our error message that we have. It returns a not found message. Do expect response.body to include possibly one of the message. There could be plenty message, but we want to make sure it includes couldn't find book with ID equals 0. Okay. Couldn't find with book ID equals 0. All right, so I think that is that for the get item, get book item. So let's look at creating a book. So you have describe, post, books, ID, do. So you have let, history. I'm going to create a category with history category, create category. So it's just going to generate a random category using our fact report. So let valid attribute, valid attributes, do. So I'm going to have title of a book, Whispers of Time, author, Dr. Krishma, I think. Saksema, doesn't matter, you can put any book. Then we have a category ID, category underscore ID to be history, history.id. Okay, we have that. Any other thing? No, we're done here. Okay, let's look at each context. Context when requests attributes are valid. Do. So before we do each of the example, we want to post API version 1 books params valid attributes. Okay. So it should return. It returns status code 201. Do. I'm just going to move this. All right, that's created. Status code for created. So what of context when attributes are not valid? So I'm just going to copy this. Invalid. Okay. context when attributes are invalid. So here the params is going to just be an empty param. Is that okay? Empty param. No value given. So we would have a status code 422 unprocessed entity, right? 422. Okay, so the next one, there should be a fail message. It returns a failure message. So we expect our response.body to include, there will be a lot of message, but that's why we're not using to equal to, but to include can't be blank. Because it will show title can be blank, author can be blank, category can be blank. So this is it. Okay, we are done with that. Now let's look at, we're done with posts. Let's look at how, if we want to, the context where we want to update a book. So describe, don't worry, we'll soon be done. Puts books ID do let valid attributes. So we have title. So we are trying to edit a book to saffron salt. We are editing just the title, updating only the title. So, but before each attribute, we want to call the endpoint. API, where you want books, and I'm calling book underscore ID. Then we would supply it with params, valid attribute. Okay, that's fine. So now let's context when book exists. Do. So it returns status code 204. Do. As usual, I'm going to copy expect response to have a status code of 204. It updates books, the book. So updated item is equals to book.find book underscore ID. Okay, we find the book, then we expect the updated item dot title to equal to the title we gave it. This is it, this one. We expect it to match it. All right, so context when book doesn't exist. When book does not exist. Do. So first we are going to create an ID that we know definitely does not exist. 0, of course. So status code stuff. So we are going to have 404 not found. Normal stuff. So we are also going to found a not found, could not find book with ID message, just like we had in the other time. not found message, could not found book with ID equals to 0. And that brings us to the end of our edit. So finally, the destroy method. Where did you start? Where did you end? Okay. So we are going to describe deletes books with ID do. So before we carry out the delete on API v1 as books slash book underscore ID. Status code, normal stuff. So we have that. It returns a status code of 204 to have that. So I will just stop here. So that's basically it for the specs. Wow, that was a long one. So let's run and make sure everything is going on fine. Of course, we are going to get our error. So our spec request books. Oh, the red. So we have action. First, we have a routing error. We do not have any route that matches all of this. So the first thing we are going to do is fix our route. Config. Okay, we have our route open here. So I'm going to add the same thing here. So copy paste books. We're going to have index create. We have a show method for individual book and update method. I think that's basically that. So if we try out again, there won't be any route error at least. But we still have a failed test. So now the actions are failing. Update action. I'm saying, did you mean JSON response? I don't know yet. So let's. Okay, now let's get into our controller and write some code. Books controller. All right. Oh, so the first thing is I'm going to write the private methods as usual that will help me in this episode. Private method. So we're going to have our books param, def book underscore params dot permits. So we're going to have title, author, and category underscore ID. All right. And so we are going to have, just like we had in our category for set book, sets underscore book. And so I don't get confused. So our book is equals to book dot find params ID. I hope that's correct. Okay. So first thing first, we are going to set the before action so that we use the set book. Before action, we want to use set book only for this time. I think we have a lot of folks with the update is going to use it, the show is going to use it, and the destroy method is going to use it. Okay, that makes sense. So the index method, which is for get books, the first on our list now. So add books equals to book.all. No. Book.all. So render JSON. Okay, just like we have the other representer, we're going to have books representer as well. New, add books text in, then render as JSON. Nice. So let's look at the create method for posting. Create and so here we'll have book. Okay, here we'll have book equals to book.create. So we'll call in our books param, book params. Okay. All right. So if book.save, if our book successfully saved, then we want to render, give the user a response JSON. So we're going to have book representer singular that new, taking our book object and render it as JSON. Status created. That's our 204 or 201. Else we would have the error JSON at book.errors status on process entity, accessible entity. And okay, we are doing just fine. All right, the next one is update. So we have dev update method. So remember we have the set book. So it's already set, so we just say dot update. Then we call the book params. Then if it's updated, we just set the head to no content. We're not going to do much here. So the destroy method is close. So I'm just going to copy this, change this to destroy, and just have this book.destroy. All right. So remember the setBook function happens to appear just above the destroy, the update, and the show. I did not create show. Did I create show? Oh, I missed that. All right, def show. So all we simply do is render this book, and that's all. We already have our error handling, so if it doesn't, the error handler will trigger whatever error we have. So let's be sure everything is okay. We have the create, we have the index for the get message, we have the create for the post, we have the show for the getting a single book, we have the update for the update method, we have the destroy for the delete. Okay, now let's go ahead and create our book representer and books representer to display our JSON very well. Okay, I'm going to create books underscore representer.rb. I'm going to have book underscore representer.rb. So just like we had for category and category representers, we are going to have the same thing here. So I'm just going to paste some code here. So you have book representer, we initialize it with a book. So we want just whatever we want to appear. Now in this category, we want the name to appear. We don't want the ID number, so it becomes meaningful to our users. So the same thing for the plural one, books. It's just the other one we have to map through it. Okay. All right. So now let's run our tests and see what we've got. All right, our test is running perfectly well. Everything is running just fine. Isn't that beautiful? Okay, for us to have information on some of the description we had, we will need to add some format on our spec if you like that. Personally, I do like it. So it's just to include some flag here, call it format, show me in the documentation format, so that when we run everything, you have each of them listed. So you have when each of the posts, each of the get categories, you have them listed here. So now that our test runs perfectly well, everything works fine. This would be from the part one of our lessons. In the next part, we are going to talk about authentication using JWT token, and we are going to create our user and connect our user so that each book created is tied to a user so that we know which user created a book. And we're also going to talk of adding our JWT token to our API so we have a means of authentication before someone can create a book. So one other tip I want to add, if you are doing any manual testing that you want to try out your API on your own, I personally use Postman. It's my favorite that I use for API testing. So I'm going to fire it up so that we can see what I mean. So, but I'm going to run, let me fire up the server, Rails. Okay, so personally, I use, apart from writing specs for an endpoint, it's usually fulfilling when you can test it on your code, on your development code. This is just our spec testing. So you want to populate your database with test cases, you want to see how it works, you want to try it out. So I use Postman. There's a lot of testing tools out there. I have added an article on the link that will help you see a lot of them. So here I'm just going to show you how a typical one works on using Postman. So I'm going to create a book. I'm going to create a category so you see it together. So let me run Rails server. Okay, we have 3,000. Dismiss. Okay, so I have this 3,000 category. So if you use the get method, now it returns an empty post. Okay, so if I want to post a category, I could simply come to the body, raw, make sure this is in JSON format. So I have a name mystery. So if I send, now my category is posted. So it's that easy. So I can as well look at, so if you change it to get, you can now get all your categories. So let's say we post another one, history, maybe. So if you change it to get, you should now have two categories. Right, interesting. So now let's post the book and see how it turns out. So books, so let's see, can we get books? It's an empty book, is empty. So let's post the book. So we have title of the book, our spec, let's call it Rails. So we'll have author, Ruby, could be author, category, underscore ID, I think 1 is okay. So let's see. Oh, there's an error. Oh, sorry. This. So you have that. So you see how it's rendered. So now if you do get, you should get a book. If you try to show a book with ID of 1, you should get this. So that is it, guys. You can use Postman to try out and populate your database, test it out, and see how it works. TDD might look like it slows down your development time, true, but it happened to me to take a lot of time before we get used to test-driven development. So I have gone ahead and added a link where Andre, in his article, will speak more on test-driven development, what it is and what it is not, describe 3 rules that in TDD you are not allowed to write any production code unless it is to make a failing unit test pass. You are not allowed to write any more of a unit test than is sufficient to fail, and compilation failures are failures. You are not allowed to write any more production code than is sufficient to pass the one failing unit test. Thank you, guys. I look forward to the next article where we'll continue in part 2 of this video. Please don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done that. Thank you.